The autumn wind howled through the cemetery, rustling the dry leaves and sending a chill down Ethan's spine. He stood frozen in front of his mother's grave, the letter crumpled in his trembling hand. The words screamed at him even though they were silent. "You buried the wrong body." His throat tightened. 6 months ago, he had uncovered his father's monstrous secret, the underground prison beneath their home where his mother had been kept alive, hidden from the world while everyone believed she was dead. He had rescued her, exposed his father's crimes, and buried the past. Or so he thought. Now, this letter had ripped open old wounds. His fingers traced the edges of the grave marker, the name, Margaret Carter, etched into the cold stone. He had watched this coffin lowered into the earth years ago, believing his mother was inside. But now, doubt gnawed at him. If his mother had been alive all along, imprisoned beneath their house, then whose body had they buried? The question sent a wave of nausea through him. He couldn't ignore it. He had to know. Detective Harris, the man who had helped him expose his father's lies, listened in grim silence when Ethan showed him the letter. Harris didn't dismiss it as a sick joke. He had seen too much darkness in the Carter case to ignore even the smallest doubt. Within days, a court order was secured, and under the watchful eyes of police and forensic experts, the grave was exhumed. The air was thick with tension as the workers carefully lifted the coffin from the earth. The scent of damp soil mixed with something metallic, something wrong. Ethan's heart pounded as the lid was pried open. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Inside lay a woman, pale, lifeless, her face eerily similar to his mother's, but different. The same soft features, the same dark hair, but the shape of her jaw was slightly sharper, her lips thinner. She was dressed in the same white gown his mother had supposedly been buried in, but around her wrist was a hospital band, faded, but still legible. Margaret Carter. Ethan staggered back, his legs threatening to give out. This wasn't his mother, but if not, then who was she? The forensic team moved with quiet efficiency, photographing the body, collecting samples, their faces, unreadable behind masks. Ethan couldn't tear his eyes away from the woman in the coffin, her features so hauntingly familiar, yet undeniably wrong. Detective Harris gripped his shoulder, steadying him, but even the detective's usual composure seemed shaken. "We'll run DNA tests immediately," Harris muttered, though his tone suggested he already suspected the truth wouldn't be simple. The coffin was resealed, the body taken away, and as the crowd dispersed, Ethan was left standing alone in the fading light, the weight of the discovery pressing down on him like a physical force. He had spent months piecing together his father's lies, but this was something darker, something buried so deep even his mother might not know the full horror of it. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time Ethan closed his eyes, he saw the woman's face, the subtle differences in her features, the way her hands had been folded over her chest as if in peaceful rest. Had she known? Had she been alive when his father put her there? The thought made him sick. He paced his apartment, his mind racing. His mother was still recovering in a private hospital, her body weakened from years of imprisonment, her mind fragile. How could he ask her about this? How could he tell her they might have buried a stranger in her place, or worse, someone connected to her in a way none of them understood? By morning, the DNA results were in. Harris called him in person, his voice tight with disbelief. "Ethan, the woman in the coffin wasn't just a random stranger. She was a genetic match to your mother. A close match." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What does that mean?" Harris hesitated. "It means she was her twin." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. Ethan's mother had never mentioned a sister. There were no records, no family stories, nothing. Just silence. And if his father had known, If he had used this woman's body to fake his wife's death, then what else had he hidden? Ethan drove to the hospital, his hands clenched on the steering wheel. His mother was sitting by the window when he entered, her face pale but calm. She smiled when she saw him, but the smile faded as soon as she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, then showed her the photograph of the woman from the coffin. For a long moment, his mother just stared, her breath coming faster, her fingers trembling as she touched the image. Then, in a voice so quiet Ethan barely heard it, she whispered, "I remember her." The room seemed to tilt. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his pulse roaring in his ears. His mother's eyes filled with tears. "When I was little, I had dreams. A girl who looked like me, crying in a crib next to mine. I thought it was just my imagination." She swallowed hard. But what if it wasn't? What if she was real? Detective Harris was already digging through old records, chasing the faintest trails of a decades-old cover-up. But one thing was clear. This went far deeper than Ethan had ever imagined. His father hadn't just imprisoned his mother. He had erased an entire life. And if there were answers, they lay buried in places no one had dared to look. The hospital room felt too small, the air too thick, as Ethan struggled to process his mother's words. "I remember her." The admission hung. Between them, fragile and terrifying, like the first crack in a dam seconds before it bursts. His mother's hands trembled as she pressed them to her temples, her eyes distant, lost in a memory, or perhaps a nightmare. She had spent a lifetime convincing herself it wasn't real. Ethan sat beside her, his voice low but urgent. "Mom, if you had a twin, why would no one tell you? Why would Dad—" He stopped, the answer clawing at his throat before he could finish the question. Because secrets like these weren't just hidden. They were erased. Detective Harris had warned him. If this was part of some old experiment, the records would be buried, the witnesses silenced. But Ethan needed proof. Something more than fragments of dreams and a corpse in a coffin. Harris's investigation led them to the crumbling archives of St. Agnes Hospital, where Ethan's mother had been born. The building was nearly abandoned, its halls echoing with the ghosts of decades past. Dust coated the shelves, and the scent of mildew clung to the stacks of yellowed files. The clerk, an elderly man with watery eyes and a slow, shuffling gait, seemed uneasy when Harris mentioned the year of Margaret Carter's birth. "Those records, some of them were sealed," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder as if someone might be listening even now. "Private funding, special projects." Ethan's skin prickled. What kind of projects? The clerk hesitated, then sighed. "They took twins." The words landed like a punch. Ethan's vision blurred at the edges as the clerk led them to a locked cabinet, its key rusted from disuse. Inside were 2 birth certificates. Same date, same time, nearly identical names. Margaret Ann Carter, Margaret Elise Carter. The second file had been stamped confidential in bold red letters, its contents sparse. No footprints, no family photos, just a single, chilling note. Subject relocated to Project Luminous. Disposition satisfactory. Harris swore under his breath. This was a goddamn experiment. They separated them at birth. Ethan's stomach twisted. His mother, both of them, had been nothing more than lab rats to someone. But the horror didn't end there. Buried deeper in the files was a name that made Ethan's blood freeze. Dr. Richard Voss, lead researcher, Carter Industries Biogenetics. Division, his father's company, his father's money. The pieces crashed together with brutal clarity. His father hadn't just known about the twin. He had owned the research. The realization sent Ethan reeling into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His father had funded the program that tore his mother's sister away. And when his mother got too close to the truth, he'd locked her underground and staged her death using the very twin they'd stolen from her. It wasn't just cruelty. It was calculated. Back at the car, Harris gripped the steering wheel, his jaw set. We need to find that facility. If they took kids, there's got to be records, survivors, staff, something. Ethan nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. His mother's twin had died in that coffin, alone and nameless. But had she ever escaped the project? Had she known about her sister? The questions burned, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about burying it properly. And Ethan wouldn't stop until he dragged every last secret into the light. The drive to the abandoned Carter Industries research facility was a silent one, the weight of their discovery pressing down on both Ethan and Detective Harris like a physical force. The coordinates they'd uncovered in the hospital records led them to a desolate stretch of land on the outskirts of the city, where the trees grew dense and the road crumbled at the edges, as if nature itself was trying to reclaim what had been taken from it. The facility loomed ahead, a hulking, gray structure with boarded-up windows and a chain-link fence sagging under years of neglect. The sign at the gate was faded, but the words Project Luminous were still visible beneath layers of grime, the letters peeling away like old scars. Ethan's hands clenched around the steering wheel as he parked, his knuckles white. This was where it had all begun, where his mother and her sister had been torn apart before they'd even taken their first steps. The front doors were chained, shut, but a rusted side entrance gave way with a single kick from Harris, the sound of splintering wood echoing through the hollow halls beyond. The air inside was thick with dust and the sharp metallic tang of decay. Cobwebs draped the ceilings, like ghostly curtains, and the floor was littered with broken glass and scattered papers, remnants of a hasty evacuation decades ago. Ethan's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty cribs in what had once been a nursery, their paint chipped and mattresses stained. A cold knot formed in his stomach. How many children had passed through here? How many had been stolen from their families, all in the name of some twisted research? Harris moved ahead, his own light flickering over filing cabinets toppled onto their sides, their contents spilled across the floor. He crouched, sifting through the papers, his breath catching as he held up a faded photograph. "Ethan," he said quietly. The image showed two infants side by side in matching cribs, their tiny hands nearly touching. They were identical, save for a single detail. One wore a pink wristband, the other blue. Ethan's throat tightened. His mother and her sister, together for what might have been the only time in their lives. The back of the photo was stamped with a date and a single word: baseline. Deeper into the facility, they found the records room, its shelves lined with binders thick with data. Ethan pulled one down at random, his stomach turning as he flipped through pages of clinical observations, growth charts, and behavioral notes. Subject A, M. Carter, shows increased attachment responses. Subject B, E. Carter, displays higher distress levels during separation tests. The words were cold, impersonal, as if the children had been nothing more than variables in an equation. But the worst was yet to come. At the back of the room, a metal cabinet stood locked, its surface scratched as if someone had tried and failed to pry it open. Harris forced it with a crowbar from his car, the hinges screaming in protest. Inside were reels of film, each labeled with dates and subject numbers. Ethan's hands shook as he loaded one into an old projector they found in the corner. The flickering images that filled the wall made his blood run cold. A young girl, his mother's twin, strapped to a chair, her face streaked with tears as men in lab coats observed her reactions to flashing lights and loud noises. Another clip showed her older, maybe 12, staring blankly at a two-way mirror, her eyes hollow. The final reel was the worst. It showed a woman in her 20s, her resemblance to Ethan's mother unmistakable, pleading with someone off camera. "Please, just let me see her. Just once. I know she's out there." The film cut to static. Ethan staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His father's company had done this. His father had known, and when his mother's twin had become a liability, when she'd gotten too close to the truth, he'd disposed of her. The coffin, the fake burial, it had all been a cover-up. But why? What had they been trying to achieve? Harris's voice was grim as he answered the unspoken question. They were studying nature versus nurture, how environment shapes a person, when genetics are identical. But this, he gestured to the reels. This wasn't science. This was torture. As they left the facility, the first drops of rain began to fall, as if the sky itself was weeping for what had been done in those walls. Ethan didn't speak. There were no words left, only a single burning resolve. His mother's sister would not be forgotten, and his father would pay for every second of it. The rain fell harder as Ethan and Harris sped back toward the city, the windshield wipers struggling to keep pace with the storm that had erupted both outside and within Ethan's mind. The images from the film reels played on a loop behind his eyes. His mother's twin, first as a terrified child, then as a broken woman begging for answers. He could still hear her voice, the raw desperation in it, the way it echoed his own mother's tone when she'd whispered, "I remember her." The pieces were coming together now, forming a picture so monstrous it threatened to swallow him whole. His father hadn't just been complicit in the experiment, he had orchestrated it. And when the twin became a liability, he'd murdered her and buried her in his wife's place. But why? What had he been trying to hide? Harris's phone buzzed, shattering the silence. He listened for a moment, his expression darkening, then muttered a quick, "We're on our way," before hanging up. "That was the lab," he said, gripping the wheel tighter. "The DNA results came back with something else. The woman in the coffin, your mother's twin, she didn't just die, she was poisoned." Ethan's breath hitched. "How?" Harris's jaw tightened. "Aconite. Fast. Untraceable if you don't know what to look for. And here's the kicker. It's the same thing they found in your father's safe house after he fled." The implication hung in the air like a guillotine blade. His father hadn't just ordered the murder, he'd done it himself. They arrived at the police station to a hive of activity. Officers rushed between desks, their voices overlapping in tense bursts. In the center of it all stood a woman Ethan didn't recognize. Late 50s, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, her posture rigid. She turned as they entered, and the look in her eyes sent a chill down Ethan's spine. She knew something. Harris introduced her as Dr. Lillian Price, a former researcher with Carter Industries who'd worked on Project Luminous in its early days. "I left when I realized what they were really doing," she said, her voice low but steady. "But not before I saw enough to know it was evil." Ethan leaned in. What were they trying to achieve? Dr. Price hesitated, then reached into her bag and slid a folder across the table. Inside were schematics, blueprints of a facility larger than the one they'd just visited. They weren't just studying twins, she said, they were trying to replicate them, to engineer perfect duplicates of people for replacements. The room seemed to tilt. Ethan's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. Designs for cloning vats, growth acceleration formulas, neural imprinting protocols. It was science fiction turned nightmare. Harris cursed under his breath. "So, the twin wasn't just separated from your mother. She was part of something bigger." Dr. Price nodded, and when the project was shut down, the subjects were supposed to be reintegrated into society. But some of them knew too much, like your mother's sister. She met Ethan's gaze. Your father couldn't risk her talking, not when he was so close to controlling the Carter fortune. Ethan's mind raced. If his father had been willing to kill to keep this secret, who else had he silenced? And, more terrifyingly, were there others like his mother's twin out there, living, lives that weren't theirs, unaware of the truth? Dr. Price seemed to read his thoughts. There were more subjects. Dozens. Most are gone now, but a A few might still be alive. She handed him a list of names, each one a potential ghost. Ethan stared at it. The weight of what he was, holding, crushing. These weren't just names. They were people. People like his mother, like the woman in the coffin. Harris's phone rang again. He listened, then paled. "Ethan," he said slowly, "we need to get to your mother. Now." The urgency in his voice sent a bolt of fear through Ethan's chest. "Why? What's wrong?" Harris's next words turned his blood to ice. "Because your father's back in the country, and he just checked into a hospital 2 miles from hers." The drive to the hospital was a blur of rain-slicked streets and flashing traffic lights, Ethan's hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles ached with the strain. Every second stretched into an eternity, his mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Had his father come back to finish what he started? Was his mother in danger right now, unaware that the man who had imprisoned her, who had stolen her sister's life, was mere miles away? The hospital loomed ahead, its windows glowing like watchful eyes in the storm, and Ethan barely waited for the car to stop before throwing open the door and sprinting through the downpour, Harris close behind. The lobby was eerily quiet. The usual bustle of nurses and visitors muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. The elevator ride to his mother's floor felt like an ascent into some unknown horror, each ding of the passing floors a hammer strike to his nerves. When the doors finally slid open, Ethan's heart stopped. 2 police officers stood outside his mother's room, their postures tense, their hands resting near their holsters. One nodded grimly at Harris. "He's inside," the officer murmured, and Ethan didn't need to ask who he was. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap Ethan could see his mother sitting upright in bed, her face pale but composed, her eyes fixed on the figure standing at the foot of her bed. Even from behind, Ethan recognized him instantly. The set of his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped against his thigh, a nervous habit Ethan had forgotten until now. His father. Alive. Here. The man turned slightly as if sensing their presence, and Ethan's breath caught. He looked older, his hair thinner, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were the same. Ethan didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was in the room, his body blocking his mother's, his voice a raw, shaking snarl. "Get away from her." His father didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, a small, tired thing that held no warmth. "Ethan," he said as if greeting him at a dinner party. "I wondered when you'd show up." The casualness of it, the audacity, sent a white-hot rage through Ethan's veins. He took a step forward, fists clenched, but his mother's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. Her gaze never left her husband's face. "Why? Are you here, Richard?" His father sighed, rubbing his temples as if weighed down by some invisible burden. "I'm dying," he said simply. The words landed like a grenade in the silent room. "Pancreatic cancer. A few months left, if that." He glanced at Ethan, then at Harris, who had moved to stand near the door, his hand resting on his gun. "I didn't come back to hurt anyone. I came to explain." Ethan let out a harsh laugh. "Explain? You tortured Mom. You murdered her sister. You buried her like some prop." His voice broke. His father's expression flickered, something like regret passing over his face before it hardened again. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he said quietly. "Project Luminous was supposed to be about progress, about pushing boundaries. But when the government pulled funding, when the ethics board started asking questions, we had to cover our tracks. The subjects were liabilities. Elise, your mother's twin, she was different. She fought back. She remembered." Ethan's mother made a small, wounded sound. "You killed her because she remembered me?" His father didn't answer, but the silence was confirmation enough. Harris stepped forward, his voice tight with barely contained fury. You're under arrest, Carter, for murder, for kidnapping, for every damn thing you've done." Ethan expected his father to resist, to run, but instead the man just nodded. "I know," he said, "but before you take me in, there's something you need to see." He reached into his coat and Harris tensed, but all he pulled out was a small, weathered notebook. He held it out to Ethan. "The truth, all of it, the remaining subjects, the facilities, the people who gave the orders, people far more powerful than me." Ethan hesitated, then took the notebook, flipping it open to the first page. What he saw there made his blood run cold. Names, dates, locations, and at the top of the list, circled in red, a single word: Lazarus. His father met his eyes. "Project Luminous was just the beginning, Ethan. They never stopped. They're still out there. And now they'll come for you." Outside, thunder cracked, shaking the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, and in that moment Ethan realized this wasn't the end. It was just the start of something far darker. The notebook burned in Ethan's hands like a live coal, its pages filled with secrets so dark they seemed to suck the air from the room. His father's words, they're still out there, echoed in his skull as he stared at the list of names, each one a life torn apart by Project Luminous and whatever came after. The police moved in to cuff his father, but the man kept his hollow gaze locked on Ethan, his final warning delivered with the weight of a deathbed confession. They'll come for the research, for the subjects, for you. Then he was gone, led away in silence, leaving Ethan standing there with the notebook trembling in his grip and a storm of unanswered questions howling through his mind. His mother reached for him, her fingers cold against his wrist, her eyes wide with a fear that went deeper than anything her husband had done to her. This was the fear of a truth too big to outrun. "What do we do now?" she whispered, and for the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan had no answer. Detective Harris took the notebook with gloved hands, his face grim under the flickering hospital lights. "We follow every lead. We expose every name in here." But even as he said it, his jaw tightened. They both knew this went beyond police reports and court cases. The Lazarus files hinted at something vast, a shadowy network that had survived the death of Project Luminous and evolved into something worse. The remaining pages detailed facilities across the country, funding trails leading to shell corporations, and chilling progress reports on subjects who had been reintegrated into unsuspecting families. Ethan's vision blurred as he spotted a familiar name, Elise Carter, next to a single damning note, terminated after attempted contact with primary subject. Asset retrieval successful. His stomach turned. They'd killed his mother's twin not just to silence her, but to harvest something. From her, data, tissue samples, something worth killing for. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of hushed meetings and dead ends. Federal agencies took over the case, but their investigations stalled. Witnesses vanished. Files were lost. The media circus around the Carter scandal died down, replaced by newer tragedies, and Ethan watched with growing dread as the world moved on, because he knew they hadn't. The notebook's warnings proved true in small, insidious ways. A break-in at Dr. Price's home left her lab destroyed. Harris was reassigned after protocol breaches. And then came the night Ethan woke to the sound of shattering glass downstairs, his blood turning to ice when he saw the silhouette moving through the dark, not to attack but to watch, to send a message. "We're here. We're waiting." By the time the first anniversary of the Graves exhumation arrived, Ethan stood once more at his mother's reburied plot, the new headstone bearing both names now, Margaret Ann Carter, and beneath it, Elise Carter, beloved sister, finally found. The autumn wind carried the scent of damp earth and dying leaves, the same as it had a year ago, but everything else had changed. His mother stood beside him, stronger now, her hand steady in his. They'd fought for the truth. They'd won. But as Ethan laid flowers on the grave, he knew this wasn't the end. Somewhere out there, the legacy of Project Luminous lived on. The notebook's final page, the one he'd torn out and hidden even from Harris, pulsed in his pocket like a second heartbeat. A single address, circled in red, and 3 words that would haunt him forever. Lazarus rises again. The sun dipped below, the trees casting long shadows across the grass. Ethan squeezed his mother's hand and made a silent promise. To Elise, to himself, to all the ghosts still waiting to be found. They would keep fighting. They would never stop. And when the time came, they'd be ready.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.